There's one detail about tomorrow that nobody's talking about, and it could be the most important number of the entire March 27th event. Grayscale is seeking to convert its $2.1 billion XRP trust into a spot ETF. If that conversion is approved tomorrow, total XRP ETF assets under management nearly triples overnight. Not from new money flowing in, from existing assets being reclassified into a more accessible, more liquid vehicle that institutional investors can actually buy. 2.1 billion. That's larger than all 7 existing XRP spot ETFs combined. And Bloomberg Intelligence puts the probability of at least one additional approval at 95%. Not 90, 95. This is the detail that changes the math on everything we've discussed for 2 weeks. And tonight, less than 24 hours before the deadline, I'm going to break down exactly what this means. What 8 billion in projected new inflows would do to XRP's supply dynamics, why BlackRock CK is the missing name that could come next, and what your investment is actually worth at every price target from $280 to $28. Before I continue, this is not financial advice. I'm sharing publicly available information for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and consult a qualified professional. Let me explain why the Grayscale Trust conversion is so significant. Right now, the Grayscale XRP Trust operates as a closed-end fund. Institutional investors can buy shares, but they trade at a premium or discount to the underlying XRP value. The structure is clunky. It doesn't allow for real-time creation and redemption of shares. It's not listed on major exchanges in a format that retirement accounts and pension funds can easily access. Converting it to a spot ETF changes all of that. The shares become freely tradable on major exchanges. Creation and redemption mechanisms keep the price tracking close to XRP's actual value. And, most importantly, it becomes accessible to the entire universe of institutional investors who can only buy ETFs, not closed-end trusts. The $2.1 billion in existing assets doesn't grow from the conversion itself, but the accessibility of those assets to new investors expands dramatically, and the signal it sends that the largest digital asset manager in the world is fully committed to XRP as a spot ETF product could trigger a wave of institutional interest that dwarfs anything we've seen so far. Now, let me talk about the other applications in the queue. Franklin Templeton proposed a management fee of just 0.15%, the lowest in the digital asset ETF space. That positions them as the cost leader for any institutional allocator building long-term XRP exposure. Bitwise, Canary Capital, and 21 Shares all have applications pending. Wisdom, Tree, and CoinShares withdrew their applications earlier in 2026, but both still operate XRP products in Europe. The combined effect of these approvals would be a dramatic expansion of the XRP ETF ecosystem. More products means more competition on fees, which means lower costs for investors, which means more capital flowing in. It's the same virtuous cycle that played out with Bitcoin ETFs, where competition between BlackRock CAC, Fidelity, and others drove fees to near zero and attracted hundreds of billions. Speaking of BlackRock CAC, they're the biggest name missing from the XRP ETF lineup. BlackRock manages over $10 trillion in assets. Their iShares Bitcoin ETF became the most successful ETF launch in history. Canary Capital's CEO has said that BlackRock K would likely consider entering the XRP ETF market once existing products prove demand at the $3 billion level. If tomorrow's approvals push total XRP ETF AUM past $3 billion with the Grayscale conversion, BlackRock Kiko's entry becomes a realistic near-term possibility, and a BlackRock K XRP ETF would be the single most significant institutional endorsement XRP could receive. Now, let me break down the supply dynamics because this is where the math gets powerful. XRP has a circulating supply of 61.3 billion tokens. At current prices, the total market cap is roughly 85 billion. The existing ETFs hold approximately 1 billion in AUM, representing about 1.1% of XRP's market cap. Bitcoin ETFs hold close to 100 billion, representing about 5% of Bitcoin's total value. If XRP ETFs grow to match Bitcoin's 5% ratio, total ETF AUM would need to reach approximately 4.3 billion. If the Grayscale conversion adds 2.1 billion and new inflows add another 2 billion over the following months, that 5% level is achievable by late 2026. And at 5% ETF penetration, the demand pressure on XRP's available supply becomes significant. Here's why. Large portions of XRP's supply are locked or illiquid. Ripple holds approximately 34% in escrow. Another 17% is held by whales in cold storage. Roughly 60% of current holders are sitting on unrealized losses and are reluctant to sell below their cost basis. The free float available for ETF purchases is a fraction of the total supply. When ETFs need to buy XRP to create new shares, they're competing for a shrinking pool of available tokens. That's how supply squeezes form. At early January's pace of 43 million per week in ETF inflows, the funds would add about 2.22 billion by year-end. At the launch pace of 483 million per month, they'd reach 5.8 billion by December. 24/7, Wall Street calculated that at the faster pace, ETFs would start creating the supply pressure that forces the XRP price to adjust. The March 27th approvals could reset the inflow pace back toward launch levels by introducing new products with fresh marketing, lower fees, and the tailwind of commodity classification. Now, let me give you the investment calculator because I know this is what you want to see. The night before the biggest day at 142's, $1,000 buys you roughly $74 XRP. At Standard Chartered's 280 target, those 704 tokens are worth $1,971. At 3, they're worth $2,013. At 5, 3,521s. At 850, the Elliott Wave target, 5,886. At 20, the Emily Fool Velocity Model, 14,085. At 28, Standard Chartered's 2030 target, 19,918. At $5,000 invested, multiply every number above by 5. At 10,000, multiply by 10. At 25,000, multiply by 25. The range of outcomes is enormous, and they all start from the same price point, 142's. Tomorrow's catalyst doesn't change the math. It changes the probability that the higher end of the range becomes reality sooner rather than later. And here's the context that frames the risk. XRP's structural floor sits at a 127, where 443 million tokens in cost basis create aggressive buyer defense. At 142's, your maximum downside to the floor is roughly 10%. Your upside to the consensus near-term target of 280 is roughly 97%. Your upside to the Elliott Wave target is roughly 498%, and your upside to the 20 to 30 targets is 1,300 to 800%. 10% downside risk against 97 to 800% upside. That's the asymmetry. That's why Goldman holds 153 million. That's why a central bank is testing the technology. That's why the CME listed XRP alongside Bitcoin. And that's why tomorrow matters. The Grayscale 2.1 billion conversion could triple ETF AUM overnight. Bloomberg says 95% odds. BlackRock CK is watching. The supply squeeze math is loaded and the volatility compression says the next move is explosive. Tomorrow we find out macro storms pass. Infrastructure lasts. Smash that like button. Drop your investment amount and your target price in the comments. Let's see what this community is holding going into tomorrow. Subscribe and hit the bell. When the SEC announces my reaction video drops within hours, you do not want to miss it. See you on the other side. Wait, this is the last video before the biggest day. Let me give you everything. The Grayscale conversion deserves deeper context because it's the closest parallel we have to what happened with Bitcoin. In January 2024, Grayscale converted its Bitcoin Trust, GBTC, into a spot ETF. The trust had been trading at a significant discount to its underlying Bitcoin value. When it converted, the discount closed rapidly, and the product became accessible to a much wider investor base. Bitcoin was at 46,000 when the ETF launched. It reached 126,000 within 18 months. Now the exact same company, Grayscale, is seeking to do the exact same thing with XRP. Convert a closed-end trust into a spot ETF. The trust holds $2.1 billion in XRP. The conversion would make those assets liquid, accessible, and tradable alongside every other ETF in a standard brokerage account. If the conversion triggers even a fraction of the demand response that GBTC's Bitcoin conversion triggered, the implications for XRP's price are substantial. And Grayscale isn't stopping at a single-asset XRP ETF. They're also developing multi-asset crypto ETFs that include XRP alongside Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana. This means XRP would be included in index-style products that investors buy for broad crypto exposure. Every dollar flowing into a Grayscale multi-asset crypto ETF that includes XRP creates buying pressure on XRP, even if the investor didn't specifically choose to buy XRP. That's passive demand that compounds over time as the ETF ecosystem grows. Now, let me address the 16% institutional ratio, because this is the number that will determine XRP's trajectory over the next 12 months. Right now, 84% of XRP ETF flows are retail, only 16% are institutional. For Bitcoin ETFs, the institutional ratio flipped within the first year. By the end of 2024, institutional filers represented the majority of Bitcoin ETF holdings. And during that flip, Bitcoin went from 40,000 to 126,000. The institutional flip happened because Bitcoin's commodity status was unambiguous. The products were liquid and well-structured, and the compliance barriers were clear. XRP now has all three of those ingredients. The commodity classification happened on March 17th. The products will be expanded and restructured after tomorrow's approvals, and the compliance framework is identical to Bitcoin's. The ingredients for the institutional flip are in place. The clock started 9 days ago. Due diligence cycles run 6 to 12 months. The first meaningful institutional wave should arrive between September 2026 and March 2027. The question investors need to ask themselves is this: do you want to buy XRP before the institutional ratio flips when prices are at $142, or after when prices have already adjusted to reflect multi-billion-dollar institutional inflows? The Bitcoin precedent suggests that buying before the flip and holding through it is where the life-changing returns come from. Let me also lay out the next 30 days, regardless of tomorrow's outcome, because having a calendar removes the anxiety of waiting. March 27th, tomorrow, the ETF deadline and options expiry. Binary event, we'll know by end of day. March 28th through 30th, the weekend response. If approved, watch for weekend accumulation as the news spreads through mainstream media. If delayed, watch for stabilization as the market processes the disappointment. March 31st, month-end close. If XRP closes March above A137, the 5-month losing streak ends. A green monthly candle changes the narrative from decline to potential reversal. April 1st through 15th post-decision digestion period, Farside ETF flow data over these 2 weeks will show whether the approvals, if they come, are translating into actual capital deployment. Watch for daily inflows above 10 million as the signal that the institutional wave is beginning April 15th through 30th. The Clarity Act markup window. Senator Loomis confirmed targeting the second half of April. Senator Moreno warned it needs to pass by May, or it's dead for 2026. If the ETF approvals and the Clarity Act markup both land in the same 30-day window, the compounding catalyst effect could produce the repricing that this entire series has been building toward May 4th. His earnings for your dad's position drew different asset, same principle of patience. May through June, the practical deadline for the Clarity Act before midterm campaign dynamics consume the Senate's attention. If the bill passes, XRP's commodity status becomes permanent federal law. If it doesn't, the interpretive release from March 17th still stands, but without legislative backing. That's the calendar. 6 distinct catalyst windows over the next 60 days. Tomorrow is the first. It might be the most dramatic. But it's not the only one. The story continues regardless. Now let me close this series the way it deserves to be closed, because whether or not I realize it, tonight might be the last time I cover XRP in the pre-March 27th world. Tomorrow, whatever happens, we enter a different chapter. 14 days ago, I started covering XRP daily because this channel needed reviving. Views were down, engagement was flat, something had to change. So I committed to showing up every single day with the deepest research, the most honest analysis, and the most comprehensive coverage I could produce. Over those 14 days, I wrote and presented over 35 scripts. I covered 31 individual catalysts. I researched every analyst report, every SEC filing, every on-chain metric, every technical indicator, and every political development that touched XRP. And what I found was extraordinary. Not because XRP went up, it didn't. The price barely moved. What was extraordinary was the gap between what was happening underneath the surface and what the price was showing on the screen. Goldman Sachs positioning, MasterCard integrating, the SEC classifying, the comptroller opening, central banks testing, AI agent settling, the CME recognizing, and the price sitting at 142 juarez, as if none of it happened. That gap is the opportunity. It's always been the opportunity. And tomorrow, for the first time since this series began, there's a specific date, a certain catalyst that could begin to close it. Whether it does or not, the infrastructure is real. The institutions are positioned. The regulatory framework is in place. And this community built over 14 days of honest analysis and real conversation is ready for whatever comes next. 31 catalysts, 14 days, 1 deadline, and a price 60% below all-time highs. The spring is coiled, the trigger is set, and tomorrow we find out. Macro storms pass, infrastructure lasts. Smash that like button, drop your investment amount and your target price in the comments. Let's see what this community is holding going into tomorrow. Subscribe and hit the bell. When the SEC announces, my reaction video drops within hours. You do not want to miss it. See you on the other.